When you talk about martyrdom in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or anything out of Eastern Europe, you've really got to consider the influence of the political situation. Under Poland, until the beginning of the 1940s, the Second World War, there were persecutions in Ukraine, but it really started with the Second World War, when Russia took over Western Ukraine. In 1946, when the Ukrainian Catholic Church was officially liquidated by a decree in Moscow, immediate persecution on a very grand scale started. All of the Ukrainian Catholic bishops, over 500 priests, all the leaders of seminaries, leading parish priests, professors, universities, all of the, mostly all of the clergy were arrested and sent off to Siberia. Even faithful who were still faithful to the Ukrainian Catholic Church, some of them were deported. So some people say up to about 1 million people were deported into the gulags, into the concentration camps in various parts of the Soviet Union. There was an all-out effort to eliminate the Ukrainian Catholic Church completely. Obviously, by 1946, the Redemptorist fathers were quite popular and they were quite numerous in Ukraine, and they were amongst those who were persecuted, and as a result, they became martyrs. As I have mentioned, there was hundreds and hundreds of priests and monks were arrested by the Soviets, and one of them is Father Kowalik, a Redemptorist. To some extent, the Soviets kept a very good history of all of their activities. To another extent, they destroyed a lot of archives. We have been quite lucky in a sense that the story of some of these martyrs have been recorded by looking at prison records of the Soviets themselves. Father Kowalik, for instance, was a very educated man who studied in Belgium with the Redemptorist fathers and was a leading Redemptorist, superior, and professor. And he was arrested, but there was nothing they could do that would break his faith. He is, as is recorded in the archives of the Soviet system, in 1941, he was asked to betray his faith and he wouldn't do it. So they created a mock crucifixion. They nailed him to a wall upside down in the prison, feet in the air, head and arms and at the bottom. And they nailed him to the wall, and obviously because of that he was killed, he died. Ivan Ziatyk is a priest who was deported into Siberia. Again, he was very educated in the sense that he had higher schooling after the seminary, studied in Europe, and was a professor. He was taken to Siberia and he was asked to betray his faith. And I can tell you that no Redemptorist, no bishop in the whole former Soviet system, of any of them that were arrested, ever betrayed their faith. They were sort of to a person, each one of them kept their faith. Father Ziatyk was asked to, he was interrogated, he was beaten, he was threatened, but he would not give in. And so what they did with him, as the grim story history tells us, they poured water all over him and left him outside in the Siberian winter, outside the door. And obviously he, as the records show, that he died, they brought him in half frozen, but he died in the infirmary shortly after that. another horrible story of persecution of a Redemptorist priest. Of course, there are two bishops that were made blessed in the year 2000 by Pope John Paul II, along with Father Kowalik and Ziatyk. It was Bishop Carneckyj. He was a great missionary. He worked in the northern part of Ukraine, obviously hated by the Soviet system, and records show that he was in some 60 concentration camps around Europe. He was interrogated for 600 hours, but he never ever betrayed any of his confreres or any other members of the church. And when the Soviets realized that that Bishop Carneckyj was about to die, they released him back home to Western Ukraine, to Lviv, back to his home country. And he, shortly after arriving from the prison camps, he worked a little bit as a missionary, as a bishop, but he died quickly after that. And then there's another story of Bishop Velyckovskj, who actually died in 1973, and he died in Winnipeg, Canada. And I had the good grace to meet him once, because I'm a Redemptorist from Canada, and I was already ordained 6 years at the time. And the news reached us that that a Redemptorist confessor of the faith had been released from the Soviet system, and that he was going to arrive in Winnipeg. He did arrive in Winnipeg, but as was the habit of the Soviets in those days, they liked to poison their victims when they were released into the West. And Bishop Vsevolod unfortunately didn't last long. Shortly after he arrived in Winnipeg, he passed away from a heart condition. And he was buried in the cemetery in Winnipeg. And after he was proclaimed a saint by Pope John Paul II, his body was brought into St. Joseph's Church in Winnipeg, the Redemptorist Church, and now it's held there at the Bishop Velyckovskj shrine, and they're visited in Western Canada by many faithful. This persecutions lasted until about 1960. Well, I shouldn't say that. The persecutions lasted until the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, which is really something like 30 years ago. The persecutions were so complete that the Soviets figured that they had eradicated all faith in Ukraine and in the former Soviet Union. And when a number of bishops, and two of them Redemptorists, went to Moscow, asked for the legalization of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, two of them bishops were Redemptorists, the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities granted authority to legalize this church, because they figured that there was probably 10, 15, or just a few of them left. And the next day, some 5 million people came out of the underground. So in this context, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, just 30 years ago, was the biggest underground Christian organization in the history of the world. Some 5 million people came out of the underground and revealed themselves as Ukrainian Catholics. And today, in 2019, Ukraine has rebuilt the church that it had in the 1940s. So there's been a tremendous regrowth and rejuvenation, and it's a tremendous story. The Soviets, when they saw what had happened, really were shocked to see that they had missed it, that the church was so thoroughly concealed that they couldn't believe their eyes.